All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the Boca Podcast. I am your host, Nathan Holritz. It is good to be here with you today. Happy Monday to you. For those of you that are live streaming with us, I hope you had a great weekend. And speaking of those that are live streaming with us, please don't be shy today. Join us for the conversation. You can ask questions, you can comment, engage with our guest, who I'm going to introduce here in just a second. But don't be shy to be part of the conversation. I want you to take advantage of this opportunity to do just that. And then for those of you that are listening to the audio version of this after the fact, as I always say, follow us at Boca Podcast, Bokeh Podcast, and make sure you keep up to date with the upcoming live streams. We'll do 1 to 2 a week, and you can join us for those conversations, I hope as much as possible. All right. Enough of the little bit of intro. I want to introduce or reintroduce actually a return guest on the show. Daniel Moyer is here. Daniel, thank you so much for coming to do this again with me.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me again.
Well, and we were actually having a really good conversation here before we started. We had to kind of cut it short and just jump right in. And I said we would come back to some of that, and I'm looking forward to it. I think there's a lot to get into here. It's a very loaded topic, especially considering we're doing a relatively short episode here today. We're going to be talking about how to overcome a toxic money mindset, and that's pretty loaded. And so let's just kind of before we get to that, give us a 60-second intro, if you will, of yourself, your brand, for those of the listeners and viewers who don't know you yet.
Cool. I am a wedding photographer for 13 years. I'm a podcaster, recently turned coach over the last 2-3 years after realizing that I do things very differently. And a bunch of my friends had said, "Hey man, you're different. You should put this out there." And so I've been putting content out there on a podcast called the Focus Photographers Podcast. I'm a twin dad and a blind optimist in the best sense of the word.
I'm kind of with you. Like, I'm 40, I just turned 43. And wow. I still think like a 14-year-old in many ways. And I think one of those ways is that I'm a little bit of a naive optimist. Mm-hmm. I like to think that as much as I can want the best out of life and out of people, and I have so much confidence and faith in people, I kind of expect the same thing from them. And I've unfortunately learned the hard way that that's not always the case. And you have to kind of guard yourself a little bit. I'm trying to balance the optimism with the cynicism a little bit better at this stage of my life.
I 100% feel that.
But nonetheless, it's good to have somebody else on the other side of me who looks at life the same way. And I think there's a lot to be gained from life. And a lot of that centers around mentality, mindset, right? And I mean, this holds true in our personal life or professional life, especially when it comes to money. And when we talk about this idea of avoiding a toxic money mindset, I'm curious if you would first define that word toxic. It's a word that's thrown around a lot in our culture these days. How do you define it in the context of this conversation?
So let me try to be as clear and succinct as possible. I think that a toxic money mindset is a mindset around money that manipulates your decisions in a destructive way, or a way that's opposite of your values and where you want to head in your life.
Okay, so that's interesting because in order to even know, I guess we have to actually know where we're trying to go in life, right? What it is that we're trying to accomplish. I just posted a reel about this from another podcast. Oh. If we want to establish and ultimately run and build the most effective business possible, certainly the most effective life possible, we want to establish some sort of direction. I mean, it's fun and it may feel artsy and creative to kind of blindly flail about occasionally. But at the end of the day, if we're going to accomplish something, at least something specific, then we have to have some type of clear direction. The cool thing about that is it allows us to filter for the stuff that doesn't work, right? Doesn't enable us to accomplish those goals personally or professionally. And so that's what you're talking about here is if something is toxic as it relates to money, when a toxic mindset as it relates to money, then that mindset is one that keeps us from reaching those goals that we've set for ourselves.
Right. And I think most of us don't really take the time to align our money and our spending with our values, right? It's way easier for people to go spend $5 or $6 on a cup of Starbucks every day than just buying the bag of coffee and making coffee at home, knowing that if you were to save those $5 every single day or however often you do it, that you'd be able to retire earlier, years earlier, or be able to have a much more flexible lifestyle, because so much money gets eaten up by these little chunks over time. And if you don't really get crystal clear on the values that you have and where you want to go in life, then you're just kind of floating around rudderless,
Well, again, another massive topic that we could spend quite a bit of time on. But suffice it to say that clarity and direction is a good thing. And
Yes,
that does
big
enable
time.
us. Sure, we can build businesses. I mean, I think back as a photography business owner for years, I didn't have necessarily a specific set of goals. I just wanted to be a professional photographer and and
Yep.
make ends meet. But that's a little bit of a reactive mindset, right? Oh, this is a cool thing, and oh shoot, I need to pay my bills. That was that was the extent of my proactivity, which
Yeah.
was minimal in nature. And what I want to encourage photographers to do, and I know you're doing the same, is based on my experience and certainly the benefit that I've seen since of creating a more proactive mentality of setting goals and ultimately learning to develop a healthy mindset around a variety of topics, including money, that we be more intentional in the way that we're living our life and certainly building our business. So that's
Yeah.
good. We'll leave that there for now. Again, it's one that we can spend a lot of time on, but let's if we're talking about the idea of a toxic mindset around money, what would you say is at the root of that toxic mindset? I know that's a loaded question because there might be multiple answers, but what's your initial take on that?
So my initial take is I think the stories that were told and the experiences that we have as we're kids, right? Like for me, it was seeing my parents working their butts off all the time. They're hustling, and they had both had two jobs when I was younger, but it never felt like we were making really good money. It never felt like we were, rolling in the dough. We always had secondhand cars and that kind of stuff. But it took me till now to realize that my parents made conscious decisions to buy secondhand cars to save money on things that didn't matter, so that way they could have more money for other things like trips and all that. So initially, I think it's these like childhood experiences and all that stuff. But as we get older, now as I was planning for this episode, I was thinking like it's everything now. I mean, when you look at Instagram, right, and not to go back to Starbucks, but are you even an influencer if you don't have your like Starbucks coffee in the morning on your story? Or even in our industry, there's like this constant marketing term of six figures, right? Like we've got to chase six figures, and that's the pinnacle of what it means to be a successful photographer. And I think that these are the things that that start to sow these seeds of doubt, or that seeds of, there's other things outside of just chasing money that allow us to have a better, more fruitful life. But I think that the root cause comes from these experiences, what we see on Instagram and what we see from our own industry,
So would you say then, I mean, could we sum that up with just an obsession with a little bit of, I don't know, like a quick fix for pleasure in the moment?
Yes.
I mean, we like the Starbucks, we like the toys. And if we get a little bit of money in our pocket, our maybe kind of childish tendency is to be like, oh, I got a little bit of money, I want to go spend it and get that thing that I want.
Yes.
So it's kind of a short-sighted mentality when it comes to money, which ultimately, of course, is just going to crush us in the long run when it comes to our finances, unless, we're like the 1% of the 1% that gets super, super lucky, wins the lottery or something, right? And that, of course, rarely happens. So really, we're in for a pretty tough run when it comes to money if we maintain that short-sighted mindset.
Yeah, but it's also just the foundation of the things that we experience when we're young. I think that is the biggest part, where the foundation comes from, right? Like if you were told by your family members that they work really hard, and you see that and they're working really hard, but it doesn't look like money is available to them, then you might start to think, well, it doesn't matter how hard I work, money's not going to be available to me. And conversations I have with people all the time will say, I'm never going to be able to retire. I can't do this. I can't live this. I can't cut my spending. And I totally get it. But also it's just so ingrained in us from our experiences at that young age. And that is something that takes a very, very long time to sift through and figure out how to come out over top of.
Okay, so I'm taking notes here, kind of old school on the notebook, but I wrote down short-sighted. That was kind of one of the first ideas that you touched on.
Yeah.
And again, almost that kind of childish tendency of just buying what's in front of you because you have some cash in your pocket. But then also I mean, for lack of a better description, a kind of a small-mindedness, right? This there's a phrase that gets thrown around a good bit these days, but it alludes to the idea that I wish I could think of the phrase, but it's a small-mindedness when it comes to money. What it is that I could potentially accomplish, I only see that at a really, really small scale, and kind of a limited thinking, a limited thought process. Is there?
Yes.
What's the phrase? I don't know why I can't think of it.
J.L. Collins talks about this. He's an author that I love that has this really great book that I'll mention later. he calls it an opportunity cost. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Well, no, what I'm thinking about more in this case is just there is an assumption, whether it's from our life experience, the environment that we grew up in. For example, I grew up in an environment where there wasn't a lot of money.
Yeah.
That certainly affected my thought process about money. When I started getting checks from my clients for thousands of dollars, I
Yeah.
first of all had that very short-sighted mindset of, oh my goodness, I don't even know what to make of this much money. First of all, because I didn't know how to relate to it anyway because of my childhood. I didn't have a bad childhood, but we just didn't have a lot of money. So
Yeah.
the idea that somebody would hand me a check for $5,000 or $10,000 or potentially even more is just like, whoa. So
Mind blowing.
yeah. But then I get excited about it. So then I'm going and spending it mindlessly, not thinking about saving, paying taxes, all the stuff that I should do. And that ends up hurting me. So that's a very practical, personal example of what you were talking about first. But then the small mindedness is if I only know what it means to live in a home that makes X amount a year. And, when we go to breakfast in the morning, we're allowed to have 1 cup of orange juice and that's it because we can't afford to buy another gallon of orange juice or whatever it might be, like that's some of what I was used to. If that's the mindset around money, it is a scarcity mindset. That's the phrase that I was kind of trying to think of.
Mindset.
If that's the mindset, then it would be easy for that to continue to own that as we go into our adult life and maintain that, whether it's conscious or subconscious.
Right. Right. I think when you're talking about like these like mindsets that you have or like toxic money mindsets, they start to manifest themselves in a couple different ways. Like you're talking about small mindedness. I also think it's just like lack of education, lack of understanding, like what's really possible, lack of clarity on what you want. But I see these like 3 different categories, and 2 of them I resonate with really closely because they were me up until about 2017, 2018. And I think they come up in kind of 3 different ways. You have this like money worship, money status, and then money avoidance. Money worship can be kind of described as, money makes me happier, or the stuff that money buys can make me happier. Money status would be things like your net worth equals your self-worth, which is an interesting one and pretty powerful. And then money avoidance is just that money is unimportant and that you don't want anything to do with it. And money avoidance and money status were absolutely me 100% to a T.
And can you give, I guess, maybe an example or two just from your personal life of how you lived those principles out, or those ideas out?
Yeah. So these are like the things that I really had to overcome so money avoidance really, that was like the core of it for me, because I saw so many things when I was younger that I feel like a perfect example was, I remember like when I was learning how to drive, everything was really great. And driving along, and I remember seeing these like fancy cars driving past me and zipping in and out of lanes, and they're Audis and BMWs. And I was like, wow, like it's a lot to afford that kind of car. Why are they driving so aggressively? And I was like, oh, well, naively was thinking, oh, well, maybe too much money changes people. Or there was a family in my middle school that won like millions of dollars. And they were like the perfect family too. And then 3 years later, it ripped their family apart, divorce and all that kind of stuff. And thinking again, money changes people, and you see these things, and it just started to solidify in my mindset that like I did not want money. I wanted to make it, but then the other side of it was this money status side of things where I didn't want it, so I found creative ways to spend it. And a lot of it was, let me just go and work at the coffee shop all the time. But I would pay for ridiculous stuff that I didn't need to pay for, like, let me upgrade to first class on a flight that I'm going to for a wedding outside the country. Just these like random things. It's like I would find ways to spend it as quick as possible because I didn't want to have this massive amount of money sitting behind me. I didn't want money to change me, if that makes sense.
You didn't want it to change you. Okay. So is there almost like this, like, I don't know, the phrase that comes to mind is virtue signaling here, but like you're trying to feel good about yourself in the way that you're not spending money? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, there was that, but it was also just a fear of what money could do to me if I had too much of it, or like I didn't think of money as like a tool to better my life, for my family's life, all that stuff. I thought of it as this like power that kind of looms over you. And it was this unclear thing in that, when Bernie Madoff stole all that money, it's like, why do people risk these like these fortunes and do all this stuff just for this pursuit of money. Well, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to pursue money at all, but I know I needed to pay my bills. So anything outside of that, I'm just going to get rid of. Anything that's outside of like, I can just pay my bills, I'm just going to get rid of. But instead of saving it, I just got rid of it. Like I just bought stupid stuff with it. And it was very self-destructive. And I think, listen, when you ask anybody like, hey, what's your feelings about money? I did this on a little podcast or a little chat that I had with a bunch of people in a Facebook group. And you'd get things like, disconcerting, confusing, scary, right? Everybody's got these things that are just wrapped up inside of them about how they feel about money. Mine was just manifest in one way. Some people aren't numbers people, so they don't want to deal with learning the numbers or learning about retirement or learning about how to save money. Some people are just addicted to like retail therapy, right? And they just buy things to make themselves feel better. These are the toxic relationships that I'm talking about, toxic relationships with money that I'm talking about, where we, for one reason or another, use money in a way that does not allow us to build the life that we want, or to do things that are destructive to ourselves, our families, our well-being. It's just a very sticky situation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to kind of take a step back though. So you talked about the idea of lack of education. That's probably really at the root of all of it, right? If we're not raised in a healthy environment, and along with that, a certain amount of education around money and how to look at money, how to manage money, certainly when it comes to business, how to manage our finances, then that's going to have a pretty significant effect on our personal and our business lives when it comes to money. It leads to a certain amount of short-sightedness, likely, and potentially a scarcity mindset too, especially if we're not around a lot of money growing up. And what that can lead to, or a couple of things that you mentioned, was the emphasis on money and its association in our mind of status. And so we behave accordingly. Going the other way, we tend to avoid money. And I wonder, I mean, this again is a loaded conversation. I'm curious about the psychology behind that, because you hear and maybe even see or read, especially from some photographers, they're like, I'm an artist, I'm not worried about the money. I wonder if they're actually not worried about the money.
You're a business owner.
Well, yeah, but I think there's some interesting psychology at play behind why people avoid the money, right? Some people will do it under the guise of virtue, claiming that money's not important, anti-capitalist, whatever the reasoning. But I think that there might be more behind the psyche that is driving those tendencies. I'm not a psychologist. I'm going to leave that just kind of hanging for now. But nonetheless, this lack of education, which leads to a short-sightedness and or a scarcity mindset that leads to this tendency to maybe overemphasize the notion of status as it relates to how much money we make and the things that we're able to buy, potentially avoidance. These are all unhealthy, kind of an unhealthy background that leads to an unhealthy mindset. And so I'm curious if you'll just kind of lead us now in the direction of something a little bit more positive. What are a few principles or ideas that we should begin to wrap our minds around as individuals, but certainly as photography business owners, to develop a more healthy mindset around money?
Yeah. Speaking just for a moment on what you said before about like being a therapist and all that stuff, like I'm not a CPA, I'm not a therapist, but I think both of those you do sometimes need when you're dealing with all this stuff that was downloaded onto your pristine little hard drive when you were young, from your family members and all that stuff. And it takes a lot of self reflection to go through this, but I think in that self-reflection process, one of the best things that we can do, like the first step, is to just increase knowledge in terms of, like gathering knowledge about what people who are good with money, what they do and how they manage it, but also just increasing your knowledge around your own personal money, especially in your business and personal. But I think if there were 3 to 5, like you said, healthy traits that we should be striving for, it's let's see, it is knowing. All right, let me boil it down to these 3. It's knowing when you do or don't have the money to buy something, right? Like that, I think, is like, if you're trying to reach for something, I think that is a great place to start. The second is feeling confident in managing it, and being able to say no to buying something when you don't actually have the money to buy it. And the last, if I'm just like throwing things out there, I think the last one is is spending money based on your values, right? Like we kind of mentioned that before, and in like the pre-show, it's having these values that you can align your spending with and know that like you're on track. And I think that reinforces the confidence that that you're trying to get around money. So if you're looking for like also things that you like, maybe actions and traits you want to have, it'd be things like, having low or no debt, saving money to meet your goals, having a safety net, and then having some kind of an emergency fund. Actually, if I'm thinking about this now, like a perfect example of like spending money on your values. My family is extremely important to me, and this past year, I think we were talking about this kind of pre-show. These past couple of years have been very, very difficult. I think, lots of photographers know what it's been like to have a business through the pandemic and everything. But also that meant that my family was not seeing the best versions of me at all. And so what I needed to do, I'm very thankful that I had this kind of financial independence awakening back in 2017, 2018, that allowed me to have a mini retirement this year where I massively took the workload that I normally have and basically cut it in half. I'm shooting like 15 weddings this year. And that's basically it, because I know what frustration looks like. I know what burnout looks like. I know what being overwhelmed looks like over the last, however long, 10 years plus years that I've been in business. So this year, let me let the pendulum swing in the opposite direction. And now I can say that, all right, over the last couple of years, I knew that our twins were going to be born and all that. So I saved up enough money to be able to have a little bit of time off. Then the pandemic happened. Now I really needed the time off this year to really balance out the love and care that my family needed to have when I just actually show up and am not stressed and burnt out and working all the time.
Okay, so I want to jump back here, and I've been writing furiously in my notebook here as you're talking, but I want to jump back to kind of the three primary recommendations, and I've distilled them down here into 3 points. Cool. Number one is to develop a certain level of money management skill set. And
Yes.
You alluded to the idea of gathering knowledge, both from good sources,
Yes.
and then ultimately about our own numbers. And we'll get to that piece here in just a second. Where did you learn how to better manage money? Can you recommend 2 or 3 good resources for our listeners?
Yeah. So my financial independence journey started with Dave Ramsey, Total Money Makeover. I feel like a lot of people start there. He was the gateway drug to me saying, okay, well, I can actually get out of debt, because here's the real talk. When my wife and I first started tracking our finances, it was mid 2018, and we had just over $102,000 in debt. And we had been paying off quite a bit, the year or so prior. So we had a lot, and that does not include a house. That was cars, credit cards, all kinds of stuff from just my inability to spend. So when I really decided to get serious, Dave Ramsey, Total Money Makeover was the first one. And then there were several books and blogs that actually really helped. So let me just throw a couple out there. J.L. Collins, Total Money Makeover was a game changer for me, because that was kind of this whole view about money where, you could save and have this thing he calls FU money, which I love the term. Where he
Just to interrupt you real quick, J.L. Collins is actually the simple path to wealth, right?
Oh, yes, I'm Simple Path to Wealth. Sorry, I said
Total Money Makeover is Dave Ramsey. I pulled that up on screen while you were talking there. J.L. Collins, and I'm going to pull this up on screen as well here on Amazon.
Simple Path to
Wealth, your roadmap to financial independence and a rich, free life.
So good. It's so good. It's
keep
such
going
a
on
good
the
book.
thought there.
Yeah, such a good book. Sorry about the mix-up. There's that book, which really has this kind of whole view of, how to save simply, how to. He kind of redefines the term retirement for what does it look like if you have this FU money where you can take time off, you can take a break to pursue passion projects. A blog that I love to read is Mr. Money Mustache, where he's just a fascinating guy. He retired at the age of like 35 with $600,000 and just lives this like very simple life. And his whole thing is that humans need very, very little to be happy. And if you learn to kind of cut things out of your life, that you can live this very happy life with that doesn't have anything you're sacrificing for a pretty low amount of money. So he's like pretty far on one end of the spectrum, but I love like a lot of the things that he talks about. And then the last one, which is a complete game changer is called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. That one is really awesome for looking at how people manage money, and it's 20 chapters with short stories in it, and it's so it just kept me so engaged for the whole entire book. Audiobook is amazing, but there's a story about Ronald Reed. There's a story I'm going to share in a little bit about like specific traits when we get to that point. But yeah, that like all those books, doesn't matter, just pick one up and start. But yeah, they are complete game changers. So if we're talking about places to gather knowledge, those are where I would start first.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I appreciate that list. And for those of you that are looking at watching the video version of this podcast, you can see The Psychology of Money, Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness. I've got that pulled up on Amazon. But of course, we'll link to all of these in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. Let me come back then to the second point, which I just kind of summed up here as I'm taking notes, as know your numbers. So,
yeah.
And of course, developing education, I mean, there are a lot of elements of developing a healthy financial understanding and then a mindset. And we're just kind of breezing right past it here, but
it's all good.
Once we develop some halfway intelligent basis of understanding how to manage our money personally, and then how to begin to manage our money on a business level, I think one of the most important things to do is to start to look at a profit and loss statement, or at the very least, just as a business owner, looking at income and expenses, looking where that money is being spent, where we're making the money, making adjustments accordingly. When you talk about knowing numbers, is that what you're talking about, or do you have some other ideas or concepts in mind?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. And it's really like about just demystifying, because I'm not a math person. My wife is really good at math. I'm not a math person. I'm not a numbers person. And so for me, this just got to be something that I said, if I'm going to be profitable, if I'm going to be able to save for retirement for my family, pay for my kids' college, I need to really dive into nitty gritty things like, how much am I spending, every month, right? A budget, but not even a budget, just knowing, okay, I'm spending this much. This is how many subscriptions I have. This is how much money we spent on Amazon last month. Knowing the personal side, nitty gritty like that, but then also the business side, because the business side is so tricky, because it's not like, I feel like it's just always a moving target where, you've got suppliers, and this package can create this amount of net profit, and this package over here has more expenses because you have to pay a second shooter, and you have to pay for the album, and then you've got like a little bit less. And it's just a lot. So profit first, I'm sure you're if you're been in business for a while, there's a good chance that you've heard of the book Profit First by Mike Michalowicz. It is another game changer of a book for the business side of things, that really creating a system for how to manage your money in your business allows it to flow from you into your personal life a lot more clean and simple, and much more clear, because you know exactly where every penny of every check that comes in, you know exactly what it's ear tagged or tagged for, right? Where, with Profit First, when I first implemented that, I was training for a half marathon. I binged the whole book in like 2 big long runs, and I came back and I set up the accounts, and it was the most amazing feeling to a check would come in, and I literally had a spreadsheet created that money would move from that one account into these other accounts. And I could say, oh, I actually have this much money set aside to pay my cost of goods sold. Oh, this money right here is allotted for gear. This money right here, all down to the cent, this money right here is mine. This money gets moved to my account twice a month. I get paid twice a month, rather than just, oh, I got to check in. What do I have to pay? What do I have to do? It just creates this system for you that allows you to really get into a rhythm. And that was something that, as a creative, was not easy, because, like I said, I'm not a math person, I'm not a numbers person. And having a system, somebody laid it out for me, was very, very helpful.
Yeah, I didn't tend to be, I wasn't good with numbers. As I mentioned, largely because of my history, and then that's the story I tell myself. That's what I blame it on, right? But ultimately, of course, it's on me, and I learned that the hard way. But I didn't have the education and the experience and the background in it, and then as a result, I had a certain, and I guess not just as a result of that background, but then also maybe a few negative experiences. I had a certain fear around numbers, and so I tended to avoid it. And it's very easy as creative types or emotional personality types, which I definitely am one, to say, I am not, whatever, fill in the blank.
Right.
And what we should be saying, I think a more healthy way to go about that is to say, my tendency is, or I don't have the tendency toward, but I have the ability as an intelligent human being who can make choices for themselves to go and educate myself. And there are a million resources. You just shared a really great list of them. And there are a million more. YouTube, individually, in person, we can hire somebody to help coach us, a financial consultant, or otherwise. There's so many different resources out there that we can actually leverage. So yes, though that may not be our specialty or our natural strength, there are plenty of resources out there, and we have the ability to make the choice to begin to educate ourselves and surround ourselves with the resources necessary to become better at the same. Because if we're going to build a business at the end of the day, we can't just write it off to, or write the lack of success off to, I'm not a numbers person. We have to take it on. We have to face it and be willing to embrace it, at least to a certain level, so that we can understand it well enough. And that's what we're talking about here. We have to develop basic money management skills, but then we have to begin to develop a certain amount of awareness of the numbers, looking at, again, income and expenses and how that relates to our marketing efforts, and making intelligent decisions based on the actual numbers. You talked about personal spending. I am subscribed to what used to be called Truebill. I think it's now Rocket Finance or something like that. I don't know why they changed, but what used to be Truebill, if you just, anybody listening in can do a quick Google search. It's an incredible app, beautiful app. In fact, let me just pull it up here so I tell you guys the exact correct app. It is called Rocket Money. And it is the most beautiful, user-friendly resource that you can tie to your bank accounts, investment accounts, etc. It pulls it all into one place. Really easy picture. You can create a budget. You can manage and track your spending. And just develop awareness, but then be more intentional in your spending. So there's really no excuses in the end. And that's the cool thing right now in 2022 is we have these tools that make this whole process so much easier. We have the resources, but we have the tools to leverage like this that will enable us to be more intelligent, not only personally with our finances, but with our business finances as well. QuickBooks. I remember when I started in 2000, I don't know, 3, something like that I started using QuickBooks. It was, CDs. You had to burn the file to the CD and then take it to your accountant and drop it off. And the software itself was clunky. That has drastically changed. And somebody who, again, has really little to no schooling in financial management, especially when it comes to business, can just plug and play now. And there's no excuse but to do just that. One, take advantage of a lot of the automation built into this type of software, and then look at something like a profit and loss statement. See where I'm bringing money in, see where I'm losing money, make adjustments accordingly. And if we just start with these basics, we're in a really great place. We know what it is that we need to make because we've created a budget for ourselves using this software, something like Rocket Money. And then we are able to make decisions about the business model that we want to make in order to make this much money, to pay our bills, to put money in savings. And then we can make adjustments to that business model based on the numbers that we're seeing in something like QuickBooks. And it's that, again, it's not that complicated. That's not rocket science. We don't have to be numbers people or money people to be able to do those things. That's really straightforward. If you can pick up your phone and play around with an app, then you can do that stuff.
Yeah, one of the things an exercise that I still do every year, I had a Truebill, and so sometimes I try to take technology out of the equation for myself. And an exercise that I love to do is when the year starts to come to an end, I just pick 3 random months. Like, we went on vacation in July and we went to my mother-in-law's beach house. So that's probably not a good month. That might be a low month. I'll kind of pick 3 months where I think, maybe we had this big life thing going on. And I just open our bank statement and I create like 5 different columns for, like Amazon, eating out, groceries, debt, and then, bills, things like that. And I just go through and I just write down the amounts because for me, it's easier. I don't know. Sometimes, like I said, technology just freaks me out. So I like the pen on paper aspect of like, let me go through, here's my categories. And it's like, okay, I'll compare those 3 months and oh my God, we spent how much on Amazon this month, or we spent how much on ordering in when, we've still got this debt we're trying to knock down. And you just get this, that's what I mean by clarity, is just these like very basic exercises, just looking at, okay, this is my actual bank account. This is the money that actually came out of my bank account for the transactions that we had. And the last thing I want to say was one of the first things you mentioned when you started talking, which was, we try to get clarity around something, and we have fears around certain things. And I think I've started to train myself in, if I feel resistance to something, if I feel that I'm unclear somewhere, I just start to lean in, and I just get really curious about that aspect, right? So I'm not a numbers guy, but I won't leave it at that, where I can be a numbers guy. I'm an extremely emotional, empathetic person, and I used to think that was something that was not good about me. But now I view it as a strength, because I can empathize really deeply with other people. And there's these things about us that we're put into a hole, or we box ourselves in. But when we get really interested in changing our lives, or really interested in that thing that we have this resistance to, we can start to really learn and grow from those experiences. And that was the same thing that I did with money.
Yeah, it is very, and I've talked about it. Some of our regular listeners are going to probably be like, "Here goes Nate again. He's talking about it." I've talked about this endlessly on the podcast. There is a tendency that we have in our culture to do exactly what you were just talking about, Daniel, which is to box ourselves in. The hype has died down now, but for 3 or 4 years in particular, the hype around personality tests and Enneagram types was super, super high. And I understand the potential benefit there, which is, especially for somebody who's not particularly self-aware, to realize, oh man, these are my tendencies. Yep. And then now that they've developed, I think they're maybe the most valuable for the sake of self-awareness, a development of self-awareness for somebody who doesn't have a natural tendency to be self-aware. Here's a tool that enables you to become more self-aware. These are my tendencies in these particular areas of my life. The problem is people stop there. The question that I ask is, and now what? Because it is easy to write ourselves off toward particular tendencies and just say, well, that's just quote unquote who I am. Our culture is obsessed with the notion of identity. And that is you talk about scarcity mindset, that's a really limited, very small mindset when it comes to what you can experience in life. And if you open yourself to the idea, anybody listening in opens themselves to the idea that, yeah, I may have certain tendencies, and they may be labeled this particular personality type, or somebody might call me an introvert or an extrovert. Those are my tendencies. But number one, I can learn to understand the psychology behind why I have those tendencies, which means then that I can make choices to change some of those patterns for my own benefit, for the sake of my business, for the sake of my personal life, for the sake of my relationships. I have the ability to do that. And that certainly holds true when it comes to numbers. When I started to engage with my money more, and when I started to, and just more intentionally, and when I started to look at the numbers in my business more intentionally, my goodness, a world opened up that became quite fascinating. And it's amazing what you can do as a business owner when you start to leverage data, whether you're looking at something as simple as income and expenses, but other metrics that represent customer behavior, whether it's on your website or the purchases that they're making or otherwise. You can start to make really interesting and intelligent decisions in order to build your business. But unless you're willing to engage with those numbers, you're never going to be able to do that. And then you're going to talk about intuition and feeling and all these wonderful things that sound good in the moment, but that only gets you so far. And so, you talked about, first of all, we're kind of bringing it back around here as we finish up, developing a healthier mindset around money. One is to develop a certain level of money management skills, and that can come from pulling from valuable resources. And we again listed those. We'll put those resources in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. Number two is then to learn to know the numbers. And I mentioned a couple of examples there with Rocket Money for our personal finances. I've used mint.com in the past. Another great resource for doing something very similar. And then, of course, QuickBooks is the one that is my go-to for financial management, business financial management, because it's relatively inexpensive and at this point quite user-friendly. And then the third step is, you mentioned earlier, Daniel, just to learn to spend money more wisely. But we can do that once we have those systems in place that enable us to have awareness and then make more intelligent decisions. You talked about, looking at and jotting down the numbers manually on paper and looking at it. I understand different people have different approaches. But when I think about Rocket Money, for example, you talked about Amazon spending being up over a particular period of time. Rocket automatically sends me a notification to tell me that kind of thing. So for anybody who wants that simpler, more automated approach, you're overwhelmed by the idea of trying to keep up with all the moving parts, just connect your accounts and start to look at behavior, the way that you're spending money, the tendencies, and then you can make an intelligent budget and then actively track that. And again, you can do something very similar with QuickBooks in your business finances as well. So I know this is a loaded topic, and we just kind of barely scraped the surface, Daniel, but I really, truly appreciate you coming along and taking the time both to be very open and share from your personal experience, but throw some really important ideas out there, some great resources as well.
Yeah, man. There's if I can end on this like a little bit of a story about
Yeah.
money and values and all that, and it's a story from that book, The Psychology of Money, and it's a story about the author who wrote the book and they're an artist, and they're standing together in a party. And all of a sudden they see a billionaire walk in, and the author, having written about this billionaire, starts listing all their accomplishments, how much money they're worth, how much, how they got their money, did they have any windfalls, all this stuff. And the artist, sort of unimpressed, goes, well, that's interesting. I have something that this billionaire could never have. And the author's like, what? What do you mean? And he says, enough. I have enough. And I think that is what I'm talking about getting crystal clear about where you want your life to go, and designing your life and your money-making dreams sort of around that. Once you have that North Star where to go, all the other stuff starts to fall into place. And again, that's sort of a bigger conversation here, but just getting crystal clear on where you want your life to go. And that'll allow you to say, okay, well, if this is where I want to go, then I'm way overspending in this area that doesn't matter. Or what are the stories that the questions I need to ask myself that will say, okay, what are the stories that I'm telling myself, or what did I see when I'm younger that is harming my relationship with money? And once you have that, like I said, that North Star, other things become really clear that are not important. And you start to see as like, okay, this is a useless area for me to spend money on. This is a useless area that this money, if redirected, could go into this other area, which will bring me a lot more joy, a lot more happiness, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you said it's a bigger conversation, and in some ways it is. But at the end of the day, and at the end of this conversation, I actually want to encourage all of our listeners with the reality, which is that a lot of it isn't overly complicated. Right. I remember back in the day when I was actively a photographer, and one of the things that I tended to put off was paying sales tax. I mean, I knew that the date that I had to pay it by, and I would put it off to the last minute. Or maybe in some cases I put it off 2 or 3 months, and of course you're stuck with some penalties.
Fees.
But
yeah,
the irony of the whole thing was I built it up in my head like it was this terrible thing, and maybe there was a bit of fear surrounding it, and I was just annoyed by it, and I wanted to deal with it. I'd go and do it, and it took me all of 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe if that, to actually do the math, throw the numbers together, submit the form, make whatever payment I needed to. It wasn't overly complicated. And I say that because it's very easy, especially when it comes to finances, to blow this thing up and make it way more complicated than it needs to be. Number one, we start with developing what we talk about quite a bit here on the show, which is a big picture view, a clear set of goals when it comes to finances and the amount of time that I want to spend in a week making that kind of money. I then develop a business model that will support that set of goals. And then I use these two applications, and just for the sake of simplicity today, Daniel, I'm just continuing to refer to Rocket Money and to QuickBooks, just so people have no excuses, right? They can't say this is overly complicated.
Yes.
Plug your accounts into Rocket Money and do the same thing with QuickBooks. Plug your business accounts into QuickBooks and start to track the numbers. Develop awareness about your behavior personally with your personal finances. Develop awareness about your customer behavior with QuickBooks and your business finances, and begin to be more intentional in the decisions that you're making, certainly in your spending, but generally speaking, the way that you're managing your money, and you're going to be way, way better off for it. And by the way, at the end of the day, way less stressed and way less fearful about it as well. So
yeah, and you don't even need to have to know what you're looking for and know what those numbers mean right away, right? Like when I started tracking everything, it was just like, okay, here's this number. I didn't even know what it meant. But as soon as you have the next year and the next month, and you look and say, okay, well, why did I spend more here? Oh, well, I went out to dinner with my clients a bunch more. Do I need to really do that? Yes, no, whatever. But it's just having the data and starting to just dig into it and be familiarizing yourself, which I love is a good point you made. Yeah,
well, and again, I think about QuickBooks and the way that it's laid out now. Even that, it's hard to misunderstand what's there. The plus column and money in green. I think maybe they even have income in green, and then the expenses column, and maybe it's in red. Some of it is just as simple as that. And so for us to blow it up and then as a result put it off or kind of shy away from it because we've made it a bigger deal than it needs to be or more complicated than it needs to be, I just want to encourage photographers to move beyond that, because I know how that hurt me. I'm super lucky to be where I'm at financially at this point in my life, but I would be 2, 3, 4x potentially beyond where I'm at currently in my life had I been more intentional with my finances way earlier on. So I just want to encourage all of our listeners, particularly newer photographers, to be more intentional, be more proactive, and follow some of this advice that Daniel is throwing out there. Daniel, remind our listeners one more time, if you will, where they can find and follow you online, learn a little bit more about your brands.
Cool. You can listen to my podcast. It's called the Focused Photographers Podcast. It is created around this idea of, sequences or themes of episodes where I release, 4 or 5 episodes on one topic. And then sometimes I do some solo episodes whenever the feeling strikes. Another place that I'm really spending a lot of time is my newsletter. I'm trying to spend a little bit less time on social media, and we're all in our emails anyway. So I have a weekly newsletter that is filled with silly stories, sensible business advice, and some hype to get you through your wedding weekend. It is just written for wedding photographers too. You can go to focusphotographers.com/newsletter, and then I am on Instagram at @GetFocusedPhotographers. And I also have to shout out one silly little account. It's the 4 Dadtographers. It's me and 3 buddies, and we create stupid reels about the photography world to give people a laugh and about being dads and all that stuff. It's a good time.
Okay. Cool. That was the one I didn't have. And anybody watching the video, it's not up on screen. So we'll link to that in the show notes, bokehpodcast.com. For those of you listening, and make sure to take advantage of the resources there at the show notes, especially all the resources that were mentioned today. Thanks again, Daniel, for all your time, for sharing with our listeners today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.